Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Started with DevExtreme Web, presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknall and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. In today's session, they will show you how to apply your existing C# or VB skills in a rich client-side application, see how to create a lightweight web application, implement DevExtreme controls and basic binding techniques, apply your C# skill set to a Typescript application, plus consume data from a WebAPI. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Julian and Paul. Good morning, guys.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, and welcome everybody to Getting Started with DevExtreme Web. Now, Julian, I don't actually have to ask if you're on the call today.
That is correct, because we happen to be in the same room, not a virtual room, an actual physical room here in the offices in Glendale, the DevExpress offices. And very nice it is too.
So the same time zone, the same office.
Absolutely.
And we have a guest appearance as well from our esteemed colleague, Amy. Say good morning, Amy.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
For those that may receive emails or phone calls, Amy does a fantastic job with
Team cares, yes.
Yeah.
Keeping everything running along. So
Absolutely.
it's good to have her with us. So what are we going to talk about today, Mr. Bucknall?
So we're going to talk about moving a WebForms application onto DevExtreme, or to put it more broadly than that, I suppose, a server-side application for the web to make it more client-side. Now, why on earth would we want to do that?
Well, we've done a few presentations lately that talk about the likes of TypeScript using ASP.NET WebForms, and you know, there's still a lot of people choosing WebForms as a technology. I myself love it. I'm loving using TypeScript with it too for some client-side stuff. Why indeed would I not use WebForms?
Well, the thing about WebForms is it's, if you like, I was going to say an old technology, but a traditional technology, shall we say. It first came out in 2002. In 2002, if you cast your minds back to those bygone years when browsers were browsers and did things differently. And one of the main things that was different about those days is the JavaScript interpreters inside browsers was extraordinarily slow. Remind yourselves that the first real fast compiler for JavaScript was the V8 engine, which was written by Google, and that came out in September 2008. So for 6 years, ASP.NET was, if you like, ruling the world with its ability to create your web UI on the server, and you didn't really worry about what was happening on the browser. It did all the work for you. And so nowadays, here we are 8 years later than that, the JavaScript interpreters inside our browsers are A, more standardized, and B, a lot faster. SpiderMonkey, as far as I could work out, came out in, or the very fast version of SpiderMonkey came out in Firefox 18, which was in 2011. So since then, we have, as I said, very fast JavaScript interpreters. So we can concentrate a lot more on interactivity on the browser, in other words, within the end user space, and make it more easy to use, faster. We don't have to wait a lot. We don't have to, wait for the callback to come back from the server with more data, or not even more data, but a different view. We can actually change the view within the client side itself. And I think that's the main reason for wanting to, if you like, move from a pure WebForms type application into something which is more interactive and pretty and beautiful on the client side.
So in summary, you're saying more work on the client because the devices are more intelligent.
Indeed, yes, the device is more intelligent and faster. And that's a good word to use, devices. That's the other big change from way back when in 2002, is we have these wonderful smaller devices. I mean, here I am with my iPhone, and there you are with your iPhone. We can run applications on those phones, web applications on those phones, and similarly tablets. So that's another big change. And it's better to let the client do all the, oh, I'm running on a smaller screen, than have the server say, oh, it's, user 18,000 here and is using a small device. It's a lot cleaner on the server side, and it's a lot easier on the client side, I'd say.
Now, one of the key things here is, as a C# developer and well, I suppose you're never an XVB developer, but
well, okay, I was never a VB developer, but go on.
The goal is to take the skill set of a WinForms or a WebForms developer and move it onto that client side with minimum fuss. Now, we've put together a really simple, first of all, the agenda. We're going to review the WebForms app.
Okay.
We're going to then talk about moving even that to a disconnected model when it comes to maybe best practices or future-proofing or even a migration process.
Right.
And then have a look at the client-side app that we've created. I'm not going to have people sit and watch me type heaps of code today. I'm using a Microsoft Surface Pro with its little keyboard, and it's been driving me mad. But instead, really just focus on what you need to look at as far as some of those things, and then also where to find information, and I suppose, again, to push that TypeScript thing, why that's so important when you're making the move.
In fact, that's a good point. WebForms was great when it was introduced because it essentially gave thick client developers, like I was at the time.
Were you a thick?
Yeah, no, I was a thick client. I wrote Windows applications, and it's a way to, originally it was a way to get that kind of developer to write a web application without worrying too much about, the niceties of the browser and the UI and all that kind of stuff. You were basically writing, in this case, C# or VB on the server, and it was generating everything.
Excellent. So discoverability, I think that's the big key. And when you start working inside the HTML editors and JavaScript, there's sometimes this big black hole as to how does some of this stuff work.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start by having a quick look at a very basic web application. Here we've got a couple of ASPX panels as a fixed header and a footer, and then we've got the grid control sitting behind there, bounce some data. We've also got a menu control, which is the ASPX menu control sitting in the header. Now, what I particularly like about the WebForms technology is it's robust. The fact that this particular example, while it's usable, I can add, edit records, delete records, I've got sorting, grouping, filtering, and there's no code. It's completely bound to the data source.
When you say there's no code, I mean there's still some amount of markup that you have to write and all that kind of stuff, which we'll see in a moment. But I get the point that you're not writing a bunch of C# to do all this stuff.
Well, the other side of it is that when I say no code, in actual fact, I could get away with dropping the control onto the source panel,
right,
setting a few properties, and I'm done. I didn't actually sit there and code all that markup. I didn't have to go behind and start adding all these things. So, and that's something I've always found compelling with WebForms. So there's the example of the WebForm application, just using the grid control. Now we're going to jump over to Visual Studio and take a quick look. I'll stop the execution. I've pre-built a couple of these examples so that, again, we're not sitting doing a lot of coding. But we can see with the markup, we've got the panel coming in, we've got the menu control, and a lot of this is drag, drop, and then add some settings. But what I want to look at to start with is the fact that we're running two SQL data sources. Now, the SQL data source obviously takes care of the selects, inserts, updates, deletes, and we've also got another smaller one called DS groups, which is a association lookup for the group in that data set, which is just a select statement. Mm-hmm. If we start thinking about the likes of an n-tier design application, we want to move that data layer away from the markup. We want to have it so that the grid can still do everything it does, but not be involved in that direct binding.
Exactly. So when we're going to be talking a little later on about moving the application to the client side has no connection to the SQL data source whatsoever. It's going to have some kind of connection to in this case, we're going to do a web API or a web service. It's very much disconnected, shall we say.
As it should be.
Yeah.
Separation of concerns. So what we have here is a basic boilerplate web API from inside Visual Studio. There's only the boilerplate view, so we're not using views in here. We've got a couple of classes for models, so we've got products and product groups, and we've got the product controller and the product group controller. If I just drill into an example of the product, we can see here that behind the GET request, we've just got a wrap around a stored procedure, calling out to the connection string, and here there's a little helper class I'm going to explain. Basically, I find it a lot cleaner when you're writing, especially what I call boilerplate code,
Right.
to use enumerators to bring things forward. So I've got a list of tables that I'd have in an application, and then a couple of different types of the stored procs, so select, insert, update, delete, which makes it clean. Just read here, yes, the procedure name is going to be products, and it's a select. Now, if I was to look on the SQL Server right now, I'm going to have a product underscore select, stored
Right.
proc, product underscore update, stored proc. You get the idea.
Yeah.
And the same for every table. We can see that this jumps in and performs a read, creating a list. I mean, I've used list. We could use an IEnumerable, anything that implements the IEnumerable interface of a class called product. Jump into my class called product, and obviously I've got the Microsoft Surface, by the way, uses natural direction. It keeps catching me out. I've got a small set of enums representing the fields for using the record set get, and a lot of this stuff I actually produce just using some SQL templates. So I can pick a table name in SQL, and all this code is generated nice and quickly. So we've got support for nullable types, the properties are exposed, and the constructor there just takes the record set and checks for some SQL nulls.
So no entity framework here then?
I'm not a fan of entity framework, and I know that's going to upset some people, but you know, Dr. Greg Lowe runs SQL Down Under, and for many years he and I have been of the same opinion that, you know, and I know there's a lot of people using it and doing some good stuff with it, but yeah.
So in essence, you've created a configurable ORM. Not even configurable, you're just generating the code.
Yeah, it's boilerplate code for a data layer.
Right.
And if we then take a look at the controller, say the product controller, I've enabled the cross-origin support here. Obviously, you would not use a blanket open for everything. Just we're using local access, and it was a requirement. It was just obviously quick and dirty to put full access in there.
That's a good point to make. We're not doing anything about authentication here. We're just basically showing that you set up a web API and then you can use the web API from a client-side application. Yes, you have to take account of other things when you're doing that for a real-world application, a production application, and this is one example where you're saying the cross-origin stuff is important and you have to take care of it, just like authentication.
Yeah, and we're certainly not going to advocate that this is best practice to do everything the way that we're doing. Just to give you an idea that when you're hooking up to a web API, there are specific things steps you can take. Now, what we're trying to get to here is the fact that right now we've got a SQL data source,
right?
And I want to remove that SQL data source, and instead I want to hook it up to an object data source. So I'm going to implement an object data source. Obviously, it's going to be run at a server, and I need to give it an ID, and we'll say web products. Now, at this point, Visual Studio may slow down a second, but I'm going to use the smart tag, and I'm going to configure that data source. You imagine if somebody from Microsoft actually watched this presentation one day, that they could maybe put a filter in the drop-down, because it's amazingly long.
Stuff. Okay.
Now, we're going to scroll all the way down till we find our data layer.
Web data layer, there we are.
So
okay.
maybe I could have called it something else.
Yeah, AAA web data layer, it would have been at the top.
So you say,
just like in the yellow pages.
So you're sort of saying that my coding has a drinking problem, or just me?
Just you.
We even got a rise out of baby on that one. Okay, so we can see here that exposed into here we've got the web data layer, model, product groups, and products. So I'm going to select that. Now typically when you're building your data object, this is where you'd select your SQL to do everything that's happening.
Right.
But because it's an object, we're going to now say for the for the select, we get one of those exposed methods back out.
Okay.
Now remember, this is actually, we've added the DLL, the WebAPI DLL, into the project. So we're not going out to call RESTful services as such, but we're using the same technique behind the scenes where it's going to be using the model view,
right,
or the model controller concept to actually retrieve the data. So the get is going to return a list of product.
So that's select. The update will use the update method. Yep. Insert will be the add method, I believe. Yep. And delete, we shall delete from the key of the item.
Yeah, there's the stories behind why there's an overload on the delete. If I hit finish, we're going to now see that the object has been created. And of course we said that there was actually two, so very quickly jump in and create a second one, which is going to be the lookup for
groups.
The groups.
Right.
And I have to give it an ID, and we'll call this one W groups, which of course is completely different to what I was going to call them, so who knows what happens from here.
And you need to configure it. Same way.
But of course this time there is only, other than I find the one because it's a simple lookup, so the product groups.
Yep.
And then
And we just need the select statement, or the select method, I should say.
now, of course, what's really nice here, particularly with that, the way that the web API is being configured, it's got the ability to allow us to do the full support for all the CRUD operations, but right now we only want the get. And of
SQL
course,
data source can go away.
The next
we
thing-
can leave it there, but we have to bind it to the grid.
so we call this one W products.
That's right.
And if we have a look down through our columns, we can see that there's the data, the combo box column, and we want to call that one W groups.
Okay.
No, I think I got that right.
Yes,
Of course,
you did.
the beauty here is, because it was based on the same table, the model that's been exposed by the web API is going to map all the fields anyway. So I shouldn't need to change anything other than those two things. Now, considering we've run this test a dozen times and it's worked flawless every time, we'll
Absolutely.
just see what the demo gods
Because
are doing today.
we're now live, it's going to come up with a server error.
Yellow screen of death. No, I'm feeling pretty confident.
Oh, there we go.
And there we go. There's everything implemented as before. And of course, I'll just do a quick check on the searching. Everything works as is. So even if I was migrating a legacy application, these are some of the steps that you might take to start moving forward. So well, now we've got the web API. It can be published as well. The
Right.
current website's using it. Nothing's broken. And I can start building the client-side application to utilize the web API in a truly disconnected fashion.
In fact, that's an important point to make. We're doing this in a stepwise way. We're not going to change everything at once. So we've now proven that we've moved from a SQL data source onto a web API, same application, no other changes whatsoever apart from the bindings, if you like. So now we have we've proven two things now. One is the original application works with Web API, and the other one is that our Web API actually produces the same data in the same form, in exactly the same way, so we can now move along to the client side.
What I'm going to do, I've just set the web data layer project as the active project, and I'm going to run that. So here you're going to see some of the boilerplate stuff that gets produced. There is I was still trying to think of the name of the wrapper for the API stuff that I was talking to you about earlier.
Nope,
But there's a library that you can actually implement on top of your API that looks after the documentation, and it looks after you get to do, instead of using things like Postman to do the testing, and it's really quite an amazing bit of gear. But maybe it's just sleep deprived that I can't think of those.
I don't know which one you're talking about, but what we're seeing here at the moment is the standard UI, if you like, for a web application inside Visual Studio has nothing to do with the Web API itself. All we can see here is that we're just running it on localhost on that particular port, 2045, and everything else is under the hood, as it were. We don't need a UI for the Web API, but that's what happens.
So what we're going to do is let's make a call out to API slash.
Whoops, we lost the there we go.
I lost the port.
You lost the port.
API slash product group. And
ooh, I recognize that kind of stuff. It's called JSON. We love JSON.
we do, but interestingly, they changed the notation at one point, didn't they?
Yeah, this is one of the things we've been rehearsing this for a day or so, and I was under the complete impression that this wasn't true JSON yesterday, because I thought JSON was always an object, but apparently it changed its definition probably 5 years ago or something, and JSON can actually just be an array these days.
Certainly can. What a small victory.
And which is what this is an array in JSON.
A small victory to me on that one.
Yes.
So I'm going to leave that web API running in the background, and we have another instance of Visual Studio somewhere. So with our client-side web, we've got some links that we're going to show you later, so that's all fine. Now, this project was set up, I'm running it as an ASP web project, but what we're going to be working with is just .html files. And I did that purely so that I could speed up the process of getting TypeScript compiler into Visual Studio. What we're showing you today, you could do inside Sublime, you could do inside VS Code.
Right.
It's not a requirement to be running it as an ASP.NET application. Now, just to give you a bit of a breakdown on what's going on in the folders, I've been using the NPM, or otherwise known as the NuGet Package Manager, to add some entries into the project. If we have a look what's installed, we'll see that I added the DevExtreme Web files, jQuery, and added some definitively typed, or typings as they're easier known as, and pretty much that's about all that was added other than the prerequisites.
The definitely typed stuff, by the way, are the definitions in TypeScript of the JavaScript files, so that we can have IntelliSense within our editor in a moment. We'll see that in a moment, and the ability for TypeScript to be compiled and create the JavaScript, which is what the client-side application is actually going to run. The client-side application does not run TypeScript, and the reason we're using TypeScript is it gives C# developers an easier way into programming client-side, because it implements a statically typed system over the top of JavaScript. Essentially, TypeScript not necessarily gets compiled, but gets transpiled into JavaScript. The TypeScript is, as I said, statically typed, so you don't run into errors straight away. The compile stage will notify you of errors in your code, and so you have a better chance of your JavaScript working first time.
Absolutely. And you get to mix and match. So what we have here is a scripts folder with some files. We've got our DX stuff, which is the couple of files we're playing with, and you can see things like the typings file, which contains what Julian was just saying. We've also got the main libraries, and then we've got some content folders with the CSS and so forth. All right. Now we've got two HTML files we're going to look at today. The first one that we'll take a look at is going to be our products file. I'm going to run it up first, and then we'll go through exactly what's going on behind the scenes. In essence, we've bound the DX grid control, which is our client-side grid, to the Web API. Now, I've not applied any formatting. I've not spent any time on the columns and things. I just wanted to quickly show you that this is a true client-side. We've got the ability to do the sorting. We can turn on other functionality, things like the filter rows, and I'll show you how easy that is to actually achieve. But it's a HTML file, so it's pure client-side. There's nothing being rendered from the server and pushed forward. There's a grid control. We've got the pager, the sorting, etc., etc. So what's actually happening inside that file? I'm glad you asked.
Say, Paul, what is happening inside that products.html file?
Let's stop the execution so we can see it on the screen.
There's hardly anything there. I can see a few style sheets being implemented, or included, I should say, and then there's some JavaScript.
Absolutely. So we've got the first implementation or first call out to say include jQuery, and then we've got our own CSS file, a couple of the DevExpress CSS files and themes, and then we've got this DevExtreme JavaScript library and our DX stuff products.js.
Hold on, we didn't have a products.js inside.
Good point. Now, what happens if you're working with TypeScript and you click and drag a .ts file into your head tag? It will automatically map it as a .js, so don't freak out. In fact, if I was to show all files here, then you're going to see inside our scripts file.
Oh, there it is.
We've got that, and we've got the mapping. So, and what's really, really cool is even when you're debugging, you can be debugging in TypeScript because of the way that the whole compiler works, the mapping file, and it's really nice. But as you pointed out, we also only have a small amount of markup sitting inside this div called grid container 2. Not sure why it's called grid container 2. Whatever happened to grid container 1?
I don't know.
So
that was way back in one of our rehearsals, I think.
So let's take a look at what's actually happening then inside the product TypeScript file. Interestingly, very little.
Very little indeed. We have the first two lines there are special types of comments. They're indicated to the TypeScript transpiler or compiler that here are the definitions for DevExtreme and the definition for jQuery itself, and that will enable the compiler to compile the code we see into JavaScript.
So much so if I go var temp and say that I want that to be a DevExpress, and straight away this is UI, and I might want a DX button. So the reference paths just allow the IntelliSense to kick in, and
so here we are, as I was saying earlier on, this is a statically typed system, so you wouldn't certainly write that in JavaScript because it just would not understand it at all.
Correct, I've tried.
Anyway, so the code we've got here is inside a document ready function for jQuery. So it's going to be executed when the document is ready, and all we're doing is, in essence.
Well, so before we get there, we're talking with the audience we want is C# guys, is WebForm guys, or WinForm guys. Why document ready? What's the purpose of actually having to go and put this inside? I mean, what does dollar mean? There's, there's so many things that both you and I now take for granted that hey, dollar means jQuery, and that we could write document ready, but we shortcut it. Why do we need to wrap this inside a document ready function?
Okay, so when this goes all the way back to what happens when an HTML file gets rendered by the browser. You've got to imagine when the user goes to a particular URL, the browser issues a request for that URL and it comes back. The browser then interprets that URL or the response and starts building up document object model. It starts deciding what it can display on the screen and all that kind of wonderful stuff. And if you remember back on the HTML file, let me just show you the HTML file again. So it's going to get all this data, it's going to start downloading the scripts. It's going to start downloading these links, which are the CSS file, and the document itself is in a state which is unusable until what's called the document ready event. You can do certain things before the document ready event, but in general it's best to wait until it's ready to be displayed, to be rendered. And one of those things which helps you a lot in this is jQuery. jQuery gives you a lot of functionality which helps you manipulate the DOM that the browser is rendering, and manipulate the HTML and so on and so forth. So when we go to the the Typescript file, which will be rendered into or converted into JavaScript, all we're saying here is, hey jQuery, run this function when the document is ready, please.
So in other words, prepare it, because it's going to get loaded before necessarily any of those body tags have been rendered or added to the DOM. So get it ready, but don't do anything with it, because otherwise it's going to fail.
Exactly.
So I want to affect, obviously we're using, anywhere you see the dollar sign, it's representing jQuery. So here we're saying find an object or an element with an ID of grid container 2.
Which we had.
And do something with it. In this case, it's adding the grid control. If that was going to execute prior to the document ready, would get a blank page, because the object didn't exist when jQuery tried to do it.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, so
all we're doing here is we're calling a URL and saying it's going to be JSON that's going to get returned. Thanks very much. Get this JSON from this URL, and when you get the JSON from the URL, execute this function, this bizarre function here. It's an inline function, an anonymous function. It's going to get some data, and at that point we're going to set up grid container 2, that particular element, with a data grid, and it's going to have the data source of that data that's we're getting back from the JSON. We're going to display these columns, ID, product desk, RRP, and all that kind of stuff. And the height of the grid is 600.
okay.
Simple code, really. Once you've seen it, okay, simple code once you've seen it a couple of times.
But in essence, everything about the controls for client side is about the configuration objects and then the methods and properties.
Yep.
So the configuration object is a very important step.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the links I'll show in a little while will highlight just how easy it is to see those objects now. And when we take a look at the next page, we'll also see some of the benefits of that. But again, here's the page that got rendered. And whilst there is more code, there's less markup, but a little more configuration required than the WebForms example that we did.
Now again, notice the URL there is our localhost port number, and we're getting that JSON file which we saw earlier on from /API/product. So we're using the WebAPI from a page with it, well, from a web page essentially.
Now, being the sort of person I am, I like taking things apart, prodding, breaking. So, and literally, we know that we haven't done what I'm about to try, because as a dev, I want to know what happens then if I add something that doesn't exist. So if I say I'm looking for a column called oops, what's actually going to happen?
That would be interesting to see.
Effectively, there's no mapping to my data source. I don't know the object type that's going to come through, but I have an unbound column.
Oh, okay.
Because there's nothing there. There's nothing for it to map. So, but you're not going to accidentally end up with yellow screen of death or errors or HTTP errors, but you need to just make it. So, and in particular, one thing that I have learned the hard way, be careful of casing when you move into this world.
Yes. It is a case-sensitive world, I must admit.
It's a sensitive world all around. Now, let's have a look at our other project, which was the other page, which was default.
Okay, what's interesting about this one?
So we're starting out, we're still doing the same thing. We're saying let's add jQuery to the page. We've got our style sheets. We've got our DevExtreme libraries and our default JS page, which is obviously our TypeScript mapped page.
Right.
Here we've got a couple of things a little bit different. We've got a div tag which is marked as a header, and it's looking for a class called header as well. And we've got some other things happening. We've got grid container 2, so I'm guessing what that's going to do, and then a footer control. Let's run it first and then take a look at the code and see what's going on. Because I know for this one in particular, the TypeScript is going to be a little more
voluminous.
That sounds like you should work for a shampoo company. Oh wait,
absolutely.
No, you can't.
Oh, zing!
All right, so here we've got it matches my shirt color.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got a header and a footer.
Absolutely.
So therefore representing the panels that we were talking about before. And we've got another table that was exposed with the API. This is that lookup table.
Oh, the product groups table?
And
okay.
it's the product groups. Now, if all things are working,
you should be able to press edit. Okay.
I should be able to press edit. So here we're seeing the edit functionality of the grid. And I'm going to say I want to change the word bag filter to filters and hit save. And boom, it's happened.
Magic.
Now,
so again, we're going through that web API.
And that is actually hitting the web API in real time and bringing that in. Now, if I scroll down here, I can't remember whether I created a product called Julian. No, so let's add a new one, and we should see a new ID come in. So ID, I mean, this is where you configure your columns to say this one's read-only because it's going to be taken care of in the back end.
Right.
But I'm going to create this one and then call it Julian is in GDAL.
Okay.
And hit save.
And this is the demo daemon. Oh, you had a...
That's okay. We were playing with the stored procs and I restored the wrong database, but that's okay. At least we proved that in the web demo, which was our API, running in the background. So we had our web client and then we had our web API, and without a shadow of a doubt, we know that that was calling all the way back to that project.
Okay.
So let's take a quick look now at what's actually happening inside those files. With the idea of the web API, one of the things that you need to do is actually introduce your own data source. Okay, so a custom store. When we built the previous one, so the products one, we actually just said, look, get JSON, pass the result of that get JSON call, and set that to the data source. Okay. So the grid behind the scenes has gone, yeah, this is a bigger JSON object. I'm going to do something with it and map the columns, all this sort of thing. So
it's only a get. It's not, there's no CRUD here. No, there's the read part of it. But
correct. There's the R of CRUD.
Okay.
Now, if we take a look at the default TypeScript file, we're going to see a few extra things. One of the things that we'll point out in the links is that we're just using a straight boilerplate web API template. Okay, so if you've got a hidden existing API that you've got no control over, this is the way that you'd be doing it. Now, the boffins back in the engineering teams actually put together some helper classes that you can incorporate into your own web API to make this a lot simpler, so that you don't have to do the custom data store. But I think it's important that people get to see both sides of the coin. You know, one, there's a bit more work to do on the back end, and the client side will do. But for me, we're talking about client side programming. So I don't want to know about the server. I just want to say, boom, hit it, and do the other stuff. Again, we've got the import or the references so that the TypeScript transpiler can work with us. We've got a variable called products, and then we start to see these other things. Now, the DXBox option is what I use for the panel.
Okay.
And what's really neat about this stuff, I'm going to create a new one just to show you. I'm going to have let's call it a namey option. And we're going to go DevExpress.UI.DXBox Options. Now, here's a trick for young players. If you think you're working with a DXBox and you choose DXBox instead of options, you start thinking you're going absolutely mental, because I go DXBox and I'll go, okay, I'm going to now create the this constructor object. So I'll go Amy, sorry, caps lock, Amy option equals, and then start coming in here, start looking what's there. It's like, well, hang on, what's going on? Where's all my settings?
Right.
And
right.
it's a simple thing to make. You need a DXBox Options object, and therefore when you jump in here, you've got all those. Right. But this is the thing about discoverability I was mentioning. I don't have to start running off to the documentation, and I will show you the links to the docs because there's some great features in there to help. But as I said before, I like to poke the bear and see how it works. I can do that here. I can sit here and go, oh, well, visible. Oh, I think I know what that means. Width.
Right.
And that makes it a lot easier, and that for me is the big TypeScript win. Now, let's do width. I could set width here at, say, 500.
Right.
Which is completely valid.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could say, you know what, I want it at 80%.
Again, completely valid.
See the little error?
Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. Okay.
So, again, if you're fairly new to this, there's a couple of gotchas. Just wrap your 80% in quotes. It's valid now.
Yep.
So it's going to say
squiggly's gone away. I see what you're saying.
Pixels would be the default value, and you want a percentage, you can wrap it inside your quote. So
I get what you're saying.
And you can just keep coming through your configuration object and adding all the things you want in that fashion. And the same applies for any type of object in the DevExpress library, which is really, really nice. In fact, and I'm not going to fill it all out, but if I want to actually add a menu, because we had a menu in that original,
oh, that's right, yes.
That original one, I could come and I could say I want a menu, and then I would typecast it and say it's going to be
DevExpress.ui.menu. Let me guess. .menu, DX menu. Okay.
I'll probably go menu options.
Oh, menu options first.
Because
okay.
after I've done my menu options, I'm going to go menu equals and then create my construct. So here I can start saying things like maybe items. Oh, look at that. And with items, I may go through and set that up as an array.
Right.
And so I might say, well, there's going to be an object with a text property and all those things. It's important that you just work through that constructor, because then after I'd done all that, I could come through and I could say, well, I'm going to have maybe something on my in my page that is menu. Put my hash there.
Menu, yeah.
Hash menu, and I could say .dx menu, passing in, and you can see with the IntelliSense how easy it is to loop through all the different options I've got. So I have to create an empty menu, pass in just a string, or what I think is better is separating it out, because it makes the code so much cleaner to read and so much more manageable. So
agreed.
From a getting started perspective, I think it's well worth it. So here we can see that we have these header box, or we've got my header box, we've got my header options, footer options, and so we're just saying, hey jQuery, find a div tag with an ID element and append to it the DXBox, passing in all the header options. And as we saw from that website, which we'll run again, it built that salmon colored thing.
Exactly.
If we have a quick look at our CSS, so site.css, we can see that we have .header, background light salmon, .footer, light salmon, and I've got the absolute positioning for the footer.
Right.
Again, we've got the grid option happening. So this time it's finding the product group. Now there's a few extra things happening here. We're creating this custom store option and a load option. Load option, not so much required for what we're playing with. We look at the configuration object on the store. I'm telling it the key field is ID.
Correct.
And then we're setting up, and look, we've left them as what I'm going to call a long method. You could use lambdas in place here, which is one of the other benefits of TypeScript, where we're setting up the load function. And this is using some jQuery to actually go off, get the JSON, and pass it into our custom store, which means we're controlling the get, we're controlling the updates, the individual. So by key is where you'd actually retrieve just a single value with a URL from the API. The insert function, you can see it's just creating a JSON post with with the new values. An update is then going through and creating the put with the API values. So from that perspective, it's not difficult. There are some good examples on the website, but you do need to step through and make sure that everything's sort of slotting the right way. This is where it becomes a little bit more code than your WebForms application.
Right.
But at the same time, you only need to do this once or twice, and it's going to become second nature. And especially when if you're doing it in TypeScript, you've got this interface again, jQuery Ajax settings, helping you set things up.
Right.
I will note that the one difference here, if we just pull up the default JS next to this, so let's show, not collapse all, show all, and bring the JavaScript up, which of course is the transpiled version of the same thing. If we skip through to the store, that's using type. When I actually have a JavaScript version of this that I wrote where when calling the jQuery or the Ajax method, you can use method rather than type. And that caught me out because I was getting a squiggly line, all those sorts of things. So, and of course, that's another thing just to point out quickly. If you are new to TypeScript, it is fun just to have a look at what the difference or what happens after it is transpiled.
I would just like to point out that here we are, we're writing a custom store essentially for our DevExtreme widgets. We did do a webinar way back in February or March this year where we went into this in rather more detail, how to create a custom store, what kind of methods you have to write, these methods called by key and load and insert and delete and so on and so forth. And we talked about what was actually required for these methods, that in essence they're built upon the whole system of promises within jQuery and JavaScript. So we'll give you the link in a moment for that particular YouTube so you can watch it at your leisure later on.
Absolutely. Now, because we've introduced the binding on this one, we've said that there's the whole editing, allow updates, so we can see on our grid construction, we're passing in the creation of the custom store with the store options. We've got the DX grid options here. We're saying that the data source is going to be this DS, makes sense.
Yep.
Set the height to 500, introduce the 2 columns, and then we've got some editing options, allow, etc. Passing that to. So if we just run that for one last time, and then I want to show you just quickly where in the website you can look at some of those functions. And the left click is different to the right click. Okay, so here's our grid, and again I've not set properties. There's column options, you can set column width, hide them, all those things. But we're back to now saying there's bag filters as we did before, filters because I'm in the States.
Oh, right.
And
we're hip.
And boom, we have now got that function.
Right.
If I want to remove bag filters, I hit delete, get the warning, and boom, it's now been removed from the database. All hidden in the web API and all in real time.
Okay.
So, a couple of links that I want to point out. You mentioned before about the custom data store and the YouTube video. So if you were to go to this address, so DXPRES, and those letters,
2FZ8CYI.
You will actually see the what was the name of the webinar?
Webinar was called
Data Hose, Data Stream. Anyway,
Data something or other, yes.
and it talks in depth about the jQuery behind the custom store.
Right.
Now, this is the one I want to have a look at, and that is the options for DXGrid. So before we hit questions, do we have a browser? Yes, we have a browser.
Come on.
And let's go to js.devexpress.com, where of course you'll find all of our things. I'm going to go to documentation, and I want to go to reference.
And the grid.
And here I'm going to choose data grid. Now what's really cool with this is you'll see, I was talking about how important the configuration object is.
Yep.
Here you can see all of the properties. You can see if there's specific elements to pop out, and it's all hyperlinked. So as you go through here and you want some more information on, say, filter row, you can have a look at all the elements that belong to filter row, and then click one and it will open a new page taking you straight to that. So it's a great place to start looking at the documentation configuration. Now, as far as the elements themselves go, there's a lot of cool UI elements. In fact, I think it's be fair to say that if you can build it in ASP.NET, you can build it in DevExtreme almost. I mean, obviously our ASP.NET controls have been around a lot longer. There's more
Absolutely.
of them, but yeah, we're talking the data grid, pivot grid, charts, forms, individual charts, the gauges, the navigation elements, the editors, including cool things like the tag box, which is one of my favorites, and the box we looked at, really good for being able to do layouts, responsive layouts, and we've got the responsive box. So there's a really nice, rich collection of objects available in there, and they all work that same way. Set up a configuration element, and
so basically you're working the same way as you provide a named div inside your markup, and then you can create one of these widgets inside that div inside in your code. Basically.
If you're using the jQuery approach, that is true.
Yeah.
But of course, would be unfair if we didn't mention the fact that we've got full support for Knockout and AngularJS as well.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. And there's, I think we're in a beta for Angular too. So.
Well, we did the presentation on Angular 2 not so long ago, you and I. So.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if there are any questions.
Right, let's leave that up. So if you want to make a note of the what kind of questions have we had, Amanda? We'll just bring up our question panel here.
Trying to. I'm having mouse trouble today.
Okay. Lots of questions.
But we can't hear Amanda. Maybe Amy could read the questions out to us.
Hey guys,
no.
can you not see the question panel?
No, we can now. Yeah.
We're hoping you would read some out to us. Why don't I like Entity Framework? I will. I'll tweet about that after. Yeah, I maybe it's the fact that I'm a control freak and prefer to do everything in data layers that I can control. But there is a big debate on that. No time for today.
Yes. When you make calls to the JSON function, you have to provide the function name as a string. Reminds me of some hacky things in Reflection.
Not sure I understand that one.
No, I'm not quite sure either.
Can you have the source code for the demo? Yes.
Yes, we'll provide the source code. We'll do a quick blog post and provide the source code and the data so that you can play around with it. Are there any third-party books or training programs available for the latest DevExtreme version? There's a full documentation online. There are some training videos. If you go to our YouTube channel, which is Developer Express, you'll be able to follow along. They're like 5 minutes long, and they just basically show you some basic functionality with the DevExtreme widgets, how to set them up, how to modify them, how to configure them, and all that kind of stuff. So there is no training per se yet on DevExtreme. That's obviously something that we could be looking at in the future, but that'll be 2017.
So, well, one of the things we'd actually look for feedback here, Julian, because DevExtreme can be used with a number of different frameworks.
Correct.
What would the preferred options be? I mean, we don't want to be creating 20 hours worth of content multiplied by 3 major frameworks now, or 4. So what is it people want?
That's a good question that people should provide feedback to us. The last page of our PowerPoint slide here is our email addresses. So if you want to see some kind of training on, oh, by the way, I really want to see how you do this in Angular 2, please do a webinar, then sure, Paul and I will talk about how to do a good enough webinar for you that would give you information and give you hints and tips and tricks and all that kind of stuff. In fact, we're talking about a tips and tricks webinar in the fairly near future.
Absolutely. Real-world samples. Right. Now, are there any plans for support for React.js?
Yes, there are. The issue that we run into is with React. React is all about, basically, it's code all the way down. Code built on code on code on code on code. And the way we've designed our widgets means it's not code all the way down. We provide you with the widget. So we could provide a simple React framework, wrapper for DevExtreme, where you just get to the widget itself, so the grid. But we're kind of arguing internally as to whether a React implementation of DevExtreme should actually give you access to things within the grid. In other words, be able to break down the grid into its column headers and the individual cells and so on and so forth. So we're still arguing about that. There are plans afoot to do a React version of DevExtreme. Way too early to talk about what it's going to look like or even when it's going to be available. So basically stay tuned.
Okay, what would your recommendations be for converting an existing web form app? Start with web services, ? And yeah, as we showed today, the normal path I try and teach people is that extract that data layer out. So you separate those concerns, have your existing web app work with that new data layer, and then you can start migrating your screens or another web project along that way. Obviously, every project is going to be slightly different, but doing that web API, wrapping it, and then moving forward that way.
I think that's an important first step, to be honest. And would you really change an entire WebForms application with a gazillion screens to client-side in one fell swoop? No, I think you'd be adding new screens maybe as just pure client-side, but especially once you have the web API side of things.
But as we saw today, I mean, you can actually have your ASP.NET WebForms application and start introducing client-side screens one by one.
Exactly.
And it could be that you want to start making it more responsive, more lightweight. So it could, rather than just thinking it's a big project too hard, just bite those pieces off.
I think that's a good point. Certain screens would like to be responsive. You want to see them on your phone. Other screens, like the big data entry screens, you don't really want to see that on your phone. You don't want to do that. You want to have those informational screens, perhaps.
Which is where view switch and things like that come in. Mm-hmm. And the beauty is that you can make those choices as you go.
Yeah.
A quick note here. We've been told we've got to wrap up, but Angular 2
is coming in 16.2.
But one comment here, which was feedback for us, is that, hey, training should be on Angular because it's the most used framework.
Yep.
It's a bold statement, but I love Angular, as you know, so I'd be happy to go, look at that. But again, we'll keep collecting a bit of information and move on. So,
absolutely.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us, really.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Thank you, Amy, for being our guest listener, and Amanda, back over to you.
Thanks, guys. All right, everybody, you can check out devexpress.com/webinars for all of our previously recorded sessions and to register for upcoming ones. And like I mentioned previously, today's webinar will also be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I did post the link along with Julian and Paul's email addresses in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Julian and Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.